October 23, 2023. Boston, Massachusetts. The air in Courtroom 4 of the Suffolk County Superior Court is dead. It's the thick, heavy stillness that settles in only when everyone is holding their breath. You can smell it, the faint, lemony scent of wood polish over older, deeper smells of dust and dread. The only sound is the methodical, dripping tap voice of a 17-year-old boy. His name is Ethan Chase, and he is explaining, in calm, precise detail, how he murdered his classmate. The cervical spine, he says, his voice clear and carrying over the silent gallery, is most vulnerable at the atlanto-occipital junction. A swift, rotational force of approximately 33 foot-pounds is sufficient to cause dislocation. That's what I applied. The district attorney, a woman named Grayson with tired eyes, stares at him. The jury looks as if they've been physically struck. Leo Vance's mother has her fist pressed against her mouth, her whole body trembling. And Ethan is smiling. It's not a smirk. It's not a twitch. It's a full, serene, almost beatific smile. The kind of smile you'd see on someone listening to their favorite piece of music. It lights up his young, handsome face, all the more horrifying because of where we are, because of what he's just said. Ada Grayson finally finds her voice, shaking her head in naked revulsion. Mr. Chase, do you find this amusing? Do you find the brutal death of a young man funny? Ethan tilts his head, considering the question as if it's a mildly interesting math problem. Amusing? No. Satisfying? Logically sound? Yes. The smile doesn't waver. He was an obstacle. I removed him. The efficiency of the act has a certain aesthetic beauty, don't you think? That's the moment. Right there. That's the moment the heavy oak door at the very back of the courtroom lets out a long, low creak. In a room that silent, it sounds like a thunderclap. Every head turns. Jurors, the judge, the grieving family, the monster on the stand, they all look back. A man walks in. He's in his late 40s, hair threaded with silver, wearing a perfectly modest charcoal suit. He has the weary, intelligent look of a professor who has graded one too many essays. He is Dr. Alastair Finch, advanced ethics and philosophy teacher at the Crestmere Academy for the Gifted. Ethan Chase's teacher. He doesn't look at the judge, or the DA, or the weeping mother. His eyes go straight to his student on the witness stand. He finds his seat in the very last row, folds his hands in his lap, and holds Ethan's gaze. And Ethan's smile. It changes. It doesn't fade. It hardens. The serene pleasure sharpens into something else, a spark of recognition, of silent communication. It becomes the smile of a chess player who has just seen his opponent make the exact move he predicted. That is where our story begins. Not with a body, but with a smile. And the man who taught it how to form. I want to ask you to do two quick things. First, if you're finding this story as compelling as I am, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Second, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I love hearing from viewers all around the world. This is not a story about a teenage killer. You will hear many people tell it that way. The news will call Ethan Chase a prodigy monster. The tabloids will call him the smiling boy. But they are wrong. This is a story about the sculptor. This is the story of the man who found a piece of brilliant, cold marble named Ethan and saw in it the perfect shape for a weapon. This is about how a confession, the moment where every other killer breaks, was never a surrender for Ethan Chase. It was an opening move in a game he was convinced he would win. A game he learned at the feet of his master. To understand that smile in the courtroom, we have to rewind. 6 months before that creaking door. To a world of green ivy and old money, of crushing pressure and towering ambition. To the Crestmere Academy. Picture it, rolling lawns, Gothic stone buildings that whisper of old secrets. This is where America sends its best and brightest to be forged into future leaders. And here, Ethan Chase wasn't just a student. He was a singularity. A chess champion whose mind operated with such pure, ruthless logic it could unsettle his teachers. He had one goal, the Veritas Scholarship, a golden ticket to an Ivy League throne. And he had one obstacle, Leo Vance. Where Ethan was ice, Leo was sunlight. Charismatic, athletic, kind without trying. The kind of person who made brilliance look easy and made Ethan's intense, coiled intelligence seem unpleasant. The rivalry was quiet, civilized, and absolutely deadly. And watching them both was Dr. Alastair Finch. In his classroom, a cave of dusty books and half-erased philosophical quotes on the board, Finch didn't just teach ethics. He performed them. He would pace, a phantom in a tweed jacket, posing questions that felt less like homework and more like traps for your soul. "What does society owe the superior mind?" he would ask, his eyes drifting over his students, often landing on Ethan. "Must a genius be chained by the morality of the mob? Or does his intellect grant him a different set of rules?" Ethan would sit, rapt, drinking it in. For him, Finch wasn't a teacher. He was a prophet. Finch saw the power of his mind, called it beautiful, formidable. He validated the very arrogance that isolated Ethan from everyone else. To the other students, it was just another dense, weird Finch lecture. To Ethan, it was a manifesto. A permission slip. The day the Veritas Scholarship was announced, the tension cracked open. The project theme, The Anatomy of Truth. Leo's proposal was a community outreach program, heartwarming, photogenic. Ethan's was a 50-page thesis deconstructing the social utility of lies. The faculty adored Leo's. They were baffled by Ethan's. The slight was a tectonic shift in Ethan's world. That night, he went to Finch's office, hidden in a tower of the old library. The room smelled of old paper and single-malt scotch. Ethan didn't complain, not directly. He presented the rejection as a flaw in the system. Finch leaned back, steepling his fingers. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered a question. "Ethan," he said, his voice a low, thoughtful murmur. "In a game of chess, what do we call a piece that blocks the path of the king?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "An obstacle." "And what is the purpose of an obstacle?" "To be removed," Ethan said, the logic clean and perfect. Finch gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Not an instruction. A confirmation. The board is yours, Mr. Chase. The pieces are in play. Remember, the superior player thinks not just 3 moves ahead, but 3 levels of the game ahead. The physical move, the psychological reaction, and the truth that remains when all the pieces are swept away." He was talking about chess. Of course he was talking about chess. But as Ethan walked back to his dorm through the foggy campus, the only piece on the board he could see was Leo Vance. And the only move that made logical sense was checkmate. He didn't know it yet, but the teacher had just handed the student the knife. And the first cut was about to be made. Let's talk about pressure. Not the kind you feel, but the kind you breathe. At Crestmere Academy, ambition was the oxygen. And in the week after the Veritas Scholarship was announced, the entire campus began to suffocate on it. You could see it in the library, where the soft rustle of pages turned into the frantic scratching of pens. You could hear it in the dining hall, where conversations about sports and music died, replaced by hushed, strategic debates about project proposals. The scholarship wasn't just tuition. It was validation. It was a crown. And 2 princes were vying for it. Ethan Chase prepared for the formal proposal assembly like a general going to war. He wore his one perfectly tailored suit, his posture rigid, his notes, note cards, but a single, flawless sheet of logic, clutched in his hand. Leo Vance, 3 rows ahead, was laughing softly with a friend, wearing a blazer that looked effortlessly broken in. The contrast was a live wire. The headmaster took the stage. "The theme this year," he boomed, "is the anatomy of truth. We seek not just academic excellence, but moral clarity." Leo went first. Of course he did. He walked to the podium with an easy grace. His project was Truth in Action, building bridges with city youth. He showed pictures of community centers, talked about mentorship programs. His truth was warm, hands-on, human. The faculty advisory board nodded, smiling. It was wholesome. It was winning. Then they called Ethan's name. The room cooled by 5 degrees. He walked up, placed his single page on the lectern, and looked out, not at the audience, but through them. My project, he began, his voice cool and clear as glass, is entitled The Utility of Deception, a structural analysis of lies as social lubricant and strategic tool. He paused, letting the forbidding title hang in the silent air. Truth is not an absolute good. It is a tool, often a blunt and destructive one. My thesis will demonstrate, through historical and philosophical case studies, how calculated deception, in politics, in commerce, in everyday social contracts, is not a moral failing, but a necessary engine for progress and stability. You could hear a pin drop. Then, not applause, but a confused, collective murmur. A teacher in the front row adjusted his glasses, frowning. Leo's project had drawn nods. Ethan's drew puzzled stares. It was brilliant, but it was a brilliance that felt alien, cold, and vaguely threatening. It wasn't the anatomy of truth, it was a blueprint for its assassination. The rejection wasn't official, but it was instant. It was in the air. As Ethan walked back to his seat, the silence around him was a vacuum. He saw it not as a failure of his idea, but as proof of the room's intellectual poverty. Their minds were too small to hold his. The resentment didn't boil. It crystallized into something hard and sharp. That night, he found himself outside Dr. Finch's office again. The door was ajar, spilling a trapezoid of warm lamplight into the dark hall. Finch was at his desk, grading papers, a half-empty glass of amber liquid beside him. "You heard," Ethan said, not a question. Finch put his pen down slowly. "I was there." It was a formidable piece of reasoning. Truly. They didn't think so. "They are evaluating a proposal for a scholarship," Finch replied, swirling the liquid in his glass. "You presented a manifesto. There's a difference. One is about fitting in. The other," he said, looking directly at Ethan, "is about tearing down. So what's the point?" Ethan's voice held a rare, raw frustration. "If the game is rigged for the mediocre?" "The game is always rigged, Mr. Chase. The question for minds like yours is never about playing fair. It's about understanding the true rules." Finch leaned forward. "Leo Vance's project is a mirror. It shows the world what it wants to see: kindness, charity, a pleasant fiction. Your project was a window. It showed them an uncomfortable reality. People fear windows. They prefer mirrors." He let that sit between them, a diagnosis of the world's disease. So a superior idea loses to an inferior one because it's too true? "It loses," Finch corrected softly, "because it fails to account for the fragility of the audience." Strategy, Ethan. All is strategy. You identified the intellectual truth, but you overlooked the social truth. Leo understands the ecosystem. You studied the specimen. Who is more likely to thrive? Ethan stood in the dim light, the words etching themselves into his mind. The ecosystem. The specimen. An obstacle to be removed. The logic was connecting, circuit by deadly circuit. Finch offered a thin, knowing smile. "Do not despair. The most powerful moves are often made from a position that looks like weakness. Remember the board. The pieces. Think a level deeper." Ethan left, the dismissal feeling like an anointing. He walked across the quad, the autumn wind biting. He saw Leo then, across the lawn, surrounded by friends, his laugh carrying on the cold air. A specimen. A fragile, popular, mirror-like specimen, thriving in a corrupted ecosystem. And right then, the academic rivalry dissolved. It wasn't about a scholarship anymore. It was about proof. Proof that his mind, his window into the ugly truth of things, was superior. Proof that the ecosystem was wrong. He just needed a way to demonstrate it. Permanently. The invitation came on crisp, cream-colored stationery, slipped into Ethan's student mailbox. "Mr. Chase, your perspective in yesterday's assembly was bracing. If you are interested in exploring these structural ideas beyond the confines of a scholarship proposal, my office is open for independent study. Consider it a tutorial for the mind." A. Finch. For Ethan, it wasn't an invitation. It was a summons to a higher court. This was where the real education would happen. The sessions happened twice a week, after hours, in Finch's book-lined tower. The dynamic shifted completely. This wasn't a classroom. It was a confessional and a laboratory combined. Finch would pour 2 small glasses of sherry, a ritual of equality, and begin. They didn't discuss the scholarship. They dissected civilization. "Take the concept of guilt," Finch said one evening, staring into the liquid amber in his glass. "Societally, it's a pressure valve, a way to keep the herd in check. But for the individual capable of true, clear-eyed analysis, is it an emotion or a programmable response?" Ethan, emboldened by the sherry and the exclusive attention, didn't hesitate. A response. It's software installed by the mediocre to limit the processing power of the exceptional. Finch's smile was a slow bloom of approval. "Exactly. Now, read this." He slid a battered copy of Albert Camus' The Stranger across the desk. "Meet Massault, a man who commits a senseless murder and feels nothing. The world calls him a monster because he refuses to cry their tears, to wear their costume of remorse. But is he free, or is he broken?" Ethan devoured the book. He came back buzzing. He's free. He sees the absurdity of their play-acting. The trial isn't for the murder, it's for his failure to pretend. "And there," Finch said, pointing a finger softly at the book, "is the fatal flaw of the system. It cannot tolerate those who see the scaffolding behind the scenery. It must crush them or be exposed." Lesson by lesson, brick by intellectual brick, Finch dismantled the ethical wall around Ethan. He didn't push. He guided. He presented moral boundaries as fascinating social constructs, as illusions agreed upon by the masses for comfort. For someone like Ethan, who already felt alien, it was liberation. It was permission to stop trying to feel what he never felt. Meanwhile, in the bright, noisy world outside that tower, Leo Vance continued to be painfully, beautifully human. One afternoon, studying in a tucked-away nook of the library, Ethan overheard a conversation. Leo was on a video call at a nearby table, his voice soft. "No, it's okay, Bug. Don't cry." A tiny, tinny voice squeaked from his laptop speakers. His younger sister, struggling with math. Ethan watched, hidden by a bookshelf, as Leo spent 40 patient minutes walking her through fractions, his face animated with kind encouragement. "See? You had it all along. You're smarter than you think." When the call ended, Leo sighed, running a hand through his hair, a faint worry line on his brow. It was a glimpse of a burden, the weight of being someone's sunshine. For a normal person, it would have made Leo more sympathetic. For Ethan, it confirmed Finch's theory. Leo was a slave to the ecosystem, bound by sentimental connections, by the need to be loved. It was a weakness, a fatal one. The next tutorial, the air was charged. Finch could sense the change in Ethan, a new coldness, a resolved focus. The ancient Greeks, Finch mused, had a concept, 8. The delusion sent by the gods that leads a hero to his ruin. It is the belief in his own invincibility. But what if it's not a delusion? What if the hero is correct in his assessment of his power, and it is the world, jealous and small, that cannot bear it? Ethan's eyes were alight. Then his downfall isn't tragic. It's unjust. Is it? Finch pressed, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Or is it the inevitable collision of 2 different orders of reality? One of power, one of rules. Which one is more real? He was no longer talking about Greeks. He was mapping a battlefield. Ethan's mind was the weapon. Society's rules were the enemy. Leo Vance. Leo was just the terrain where the first battle would be fought. That night, Ethan didn't go back to his dorm. He went to the university's medical library, a stark, fluorescent-lit place that smelled of antiseptic and old paper. He logged onto a research terminal, his fingers steady. His search history was a cold plunge into darkness. Biomechanics of cervical spine trauma. Force required for atlanto-occipital dislocation. Post-mortem rigidity versus staged positioning. He read clinical papers, diagrams of vertebrae, Dry descriptions of ligamentous failure. He wasn't seeing a person. He was studying a structural engineering problem. A puzzle to be solved with efficient, applied force. When he finally left, the campus was shrouded in a cold fog, the streetlights haloed in mist. He passed the statue of Athena in the main quad, the one holding the scales of justice. He stopped, looking up at her blindfolded eyes. He understood now. Justice wasn't a blind balancing act. It was a willful blindness. And he, with Finch as his guide, was learning to see in the dark. The tutorial was almost complete. The theory was solid. All that remained was the practical exam. The night it happened, the weather itself felt complicit. A cold, persistent rain fell on Crestmere, tapping against the leaded glass windows of the old library like 100 quiet fingers. It was a Thursday, just after 8 p.m. The library was a cathedral of silence, occupied only by the ghosts of dead philosophers and a few desperate seniors in the distant glow of study carols. Ethan Chase was a study in calm. He moved through the dim stacks with a purpose that looked like studying. In his blazer pocket, a single item weighed nothing, yet meant everything, a white king from his championship chess set, polished smooth. He had planned this like a theorem. If Leo was alone in their agreed-upon study spot, the secluded biography wing, and if the security guard had begun his rounds on the east side, then the moment was now. He found Leo exactly where he'd said he would be, spread out at a heavy oak table under the gaze of marble busts. Leo looked up, his face breaking into that easy, trusting smile. "Hey, you find the flaw in the proposal." "I did," Ethan said, his voice level. He moved around the table, not to sit, but to stand behind Leo, as if to point at something on his laptop screen. "It's a fundamental structural error. Right here." Leo tilted his head back, looking up. Where? This was the moment. The moment where all of Finch's tutorials, all the talk of superior minds and removable obstacles, crystallized into a single physical act. Ethan's hands, sheathed in thin latex gloves he'd taken from the biology lab, came down. Not with rage. With precision. One cradled the forehead, pulling back. The other found the specific point at the base of the skull, the atlanto-occipital junction he'd memorized from the medical diagrams. It wasn't a struggle. It was a correction. A swift, rotational force. 33 foot-pounds, more or less. There was a sound. Not a crack, not a movie sound. It was a deep, wet pop, like pulling a tight cork from a bottle. It was swallowed by the rain and the vast silence of the library. Leo Vance went limp. A sigh of air left his lungs, and then there was nothing. The whole thing took less than 3 seconds. Ethan stood there, breathing steadily. He felt a surge of something immense, but it wasn't panic. It wasn't horror. It was validation. The equation had balanced. The obstacle was removed. His hands had executed what his mind had designed. It was, as he'd later say, aesthetically beautiful. Now, for the signature. He carefully arranged Leo's body, slouched forward on the table as if asleep over his books. Then, from his pocket, he produced the White King. He pried open Leo's still warm, slack hand and placed the piece in his palm, curling the fingers around it. A final, perfect statement. Checkmate. He took a step back, surveying his work. The scene told a story, a student, working late, overcome by exhaustion. The chess piece? A curiosity, a personal effect. It would confuse them, make them think about games, about intellect. It would point them everywhere but to the truth. He was proud of it. He turned and walked away, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. He didn't run. He exited the biography wing, turned down the main corridor, and pushed through the heavy front doors out into the rainy night. The cold air hit his face. He felt invincible. But here is what Ethan Chase, in his arrogant, triumphant focus, did not see. First, the security camera. At the end of the hall leading to the biography wing, there was a dome of dark glass. It had an out-of-order sign taped beneath it for 2 months. But as Ethan passed beneath it, a tiny red LED, hidden behind the glass, flickered once. The sign was a lie. The camera, repaired just that afternoon, was very much alive. It saw him enter. And it saw him leave alone, at 8:17 p.m. Second, the shadow. High above, in the opposite wing of the library, there was a small, arched window that looked down into the biography section. It was from Dr. Finch's private office stairwell. As Ethan placed the chess piece and walked away, a figure stood at that dark window, a silhouette against the dim light behind him. Alastair Finch watched his pupil leave the scene of the crime. He didn't move to help. He didn't call for aid. He simply observed, his expression unreadable from the distance. He watched for a full minute after Ethan was gone, watching the still, dark shape of Leo Vance at the table. Then, he turned from the window. He didn't go downstairs. He didn't report a tragedy. He walked back to his desk, sat down, and poured himself a glass of sherry. His hand, for those who might have seen it, was perfectly steady. Ethan walked through the rain, back to his dorm, believing he was a ghost. He believed he had executed a perfect, untraceable crime. He believed he had finally proven his superiority over the ecosystem. He had no idea he was already caught on film. And he had no idea that his teacher, his guide, had been watching the entire performance from the balcony. Not as a fellow criminal, but as a critic. And the review was not yet written. The body was discovered at 10:03 a.m. the next morning by a horrified freshman looking for a quiet place to cry over a calculus exam. The scream echoed through the vaulted library, a raw, human sound that shattered the institution's illusion of order. Chaos, quiet and contained, followed. Campus security sealed the doors. The headmaster arrived, his face the color of old parchment. An ambulance was called, though there was no hurry. And through it all, standing at the edge of the gathering crowd of students, Ethan Chase watched. He observed the panic with the detached interest of a scientist. He saw the grief on his classmates' faces, real, wet, messy grief, and he catalogued it as a fascinating, irrational response. He had removed a variable. The system was reacting with noise. It was also predictable. Then, the police arrived. And not just any officer. Detective Mara Cruz stepped out of an unmarked sedan, and the energy changed. She was in her 40s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a demeanor that broadcast city all over this cloistered, privileged campus. She didn't look grieved or awed. She looked busy. She moved through the students like a shark through kelp, her gaze scanning, assessing. She saw the posed body. She saw the chess piece. Her eyes narrowed. "Don't touch that," she said to a uniformed officer, her voice low. "That's not grief. That's staging. That's a message." Ethan felt a first, tiny tremor, not of fear, but of interest. An opponent. As Cruz began the slow process of interviewing shell-shocked students, she hit a wall of polished silence. He was well-liked. A terrible accident. We don't have conflicts here. The Crestmere ecosystem was closing ranks, protecting its own. Or protecting itself. It was then that Dr. Alastair Finch made his entrance. He approached Cruz not with the headmaster's panic, but with a scholar's grave concern. "Detective," he said, offering a hand. "A tragedy. An unimaginable tragedy." Cruz shook his hand, her eyes appraising. "Your faculty?" "Philosophy and ethics." "Dr. Finch." "I knew both boys." He sighed, the picture of weary mentorship. Leo was a light. A truly kind young man. And Ethan. Ethan Chase is a remarkably focused student. Brilliant, in a very specific, intense way. Intense. Driven, Finch corrected gently, but the word hung in the air, heavier. Their rivalry for the Veritas scholarship was the talk of the campus. Pure academic competition, of course. But for a mind like Ethan's, so absolute in its logic, winning isn't just a goal. It can become an existential imperative. He was painting a picture, stroke by careful stroke. Not of a killer, but of a profile. He was handing Cruz the why, without ever accusing anyone. Ethan, listening from a shadowed alcove, heard only his teacher defending his motivations. He understands me, Ethan thought. He's explaining the pressure. Cruz's next move changed everything. She asked about security cameras. The headmaster stammered. The one in that corridor. It's been non-functional for weeks. A technician was summoned. He checked the system. Sir? It came back online yesterday afternoon. Maintenance update. It's recording. The color drained from the headmaster's face. From across the hall, Ethan's breath caught in his chest. The flaw in the design. The one variable he hadn't accounted for. Detective Cruz looked at the frozen image on the technician's laptop, a time-stamped frame of Ethan Chase entering the biography wing. Then another, 94 minutes later, of him leaving alone. Her face was granite. She turned slowly, her eyes sweeping the crowd. They landed on Ethan. He didn't flinch. He met her gaze, his own cold and clear. In that moment, he made his decision. The game was in motion. The arrogant monster saw not a trap, but a new, more public board. He believed Finch was on his side, shaping the narrative. He had no idea his teacher had just handed the detective the first, and most important, piece. That's where we'll pause for today. The net is closing, but Ethan Chase thinks he's the spider, not the fly. If you're hooked, wondering how this arrogant boy thinks he can talk his way out of a murder caught on camera, then you need to be here for the next chapter. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because Act 2 is where everything twists. We're moving from the crime to the confession, and you will not believe why he does it. I'll see you in the next video. Detective Cruz didn't arrest Ethan in the library. She did something smarter, and in his mind, more patronizing. She asked him politely to come down to the station to help clarify the timeline. As if he were a confused witness, not the architect of the event. The interview room at the Boston PD's 6th Precinct was a gray, airless box. It smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. Ethan sat perfectly still in the hard plastic chair, opposite Cruz and her silent partner. On the table between them, a laptop glowed. "Ethan," Cruz began, her voice flat, professional. "You were in the biography wing last night. The camera shows you entering at 8:04 p.m. and leaving at 8:17 p.m. Leo Vance was alive when you went in. He was dead when you left. Let's clarify. What happened in those 13 minutes? Ethan looked from her face to the laptop. He could ask for a lawyer. That's what the system expected. That's what a guilty person, a common person, would do. It would be admission of fear, of playing on their board. A strange, electric calm settled over him. Finch's voice whispered in his memory. Think a level deeper. The physical move, the psychological reaction, and the truth that remains. They had the physical move. The camera was a fact. Denial was pointless, a weak man's game. So he would give them the psychological reaction. He would give them a truth so shocking it would short-circuit their simple narratives. He leaned forward, a faint, curious smile touching his lips. What happened, detective, was the removal of an obstacle. It was a logical solution, executed with efficiency. Cruz blinked. Her partner shifted in his seat. The room got even quieter. Are you saying, Cruz said slowly, that you harmed Leo Vance? I'm saying I solved a problem, Ethan replied, his tone instructional, as if explaining a complex theorem to a slow student. The Veritas scholarship was a zero-sum game. 2 players, 1 prize. His existence, his particular social advantages, corrupted the fairness of the ecosystem. The system itself is flawed, but I could only correct one variable. So I did. Cruz stared at him, her professional mask slipping for just a second to reveal pure, unvarnished disbelief. You're describing a murder. I'm describing a necessary action, he corrected. The method was biomechanically sound. I ensured he felt no prolonged distress. And the staging, the chess piece, that was for you. A signature. So you'd know you weren't dealing with a crime of passion, but one of principle. He was confessing. Voluntarily. Happily. And he was doing it not to unburden his soul, but to showcase the majesty of his intellect. He was putting his crime on display under museum lights. For the next hour, he talked. He detailed the force required, the positioning, the clinical precision. He never raised his voice. He never showed a flicker of remorse. He was a proud artist discussing his masterpiece. When he finally finished, the silence was absolute. Cruz leaned back, her eyes like flint. "You understand these statements will be used against you in a court of law." "Of course," Ethan said, almost cheerfully. "That's the forum. That's where the argument will be settled publicly. A trial isn't a punishment, detective. It's a demonstration." He was booked, fingerprinted, photographed. And in the mugshot, as the flash went off, Ethan Chase didn't glare or frown. He gave the camera the same serene, knowing smile he'd practiced in the mirror. The smile of a boy who believed he had out-thought the very concept of consequence. His arraignment was a circus. Reporters jammed the hallway. The phrase, "smiling boy killer," was born. And Ethan, representing himself until a lawyer was forced upon him, made a statement. Not of apology, but of declaration. "The world is built on lies," he said, facing the bank of cameras, his voice carrying clearly. "I chose to act on a truth. My truth. And I will prove, in the court of law and the court of public opinion, that a superior mind cannot be judged by the rules it transcends." It was a masterpiece of arrogance. He saw the trial not as a threat, but as the ultimate platform. He would use the state's own machinery to vindicate his philosophy. He would cross-examine witnesses on the stand about moral relativism. He would cite Nietzsche and Camus. He would turn his prosecution into his final, grand thesis defense. As he was led away in cuffs, the smile never left his face. He had never felt more powerful. He had taken their game, crime and punishment, and had rewritten the rules. He was so busy admiring his own brilliance, he never stopped to consider one thing. He had made this move without consulting his teacher. Across town, in his quiet book-lined study, Dr. Alastair Finch watched the press conference on a small television. The sherry glass in his hand was motionless halfway to his lips. The avuncular concern was gone from his face. In its place was something cold, hard, and furious. His perfect, silent crime, a private lesson in the corruption of a brilliant mind, was now a garish, public spectacle. His puppet was dancing on its own strings, shouting the secrets of the puppeteer to a horrified crowd. Ethan saw a demonstration. Finch saw a disaster. And when a master strategist faces a disaster, he doesn't panic. He starts planning a countermove. The confession was not the end of the game. It was the moment the real player finally entered the fray. The glass of sherry in Dr. Alastair Finch's hand didn't tremble. That was the first thing you'd notice. On the television screen, his pupil was smiling in handcuffs, telling the world that murder was a logical choice. The news anchor's voice was a horrified drone, unprecedented arrogance, cold-blooded confession. Finch didn't move. He simply watched, his eyes flat and dark, reflecting the blue glow of the screen. The avuncular concern, the scholarly weariness, it all melted away, leaving something carved from ice. This wasn't disappointment. This was a strategic catastrophe. He had cultivated a perfect, private monster. A case study in corrupted potential. It was meant to be a silent masterpiece, a dark lesson that only he would ever fully appreciate. And now Ethan had dragged it into the screaming light of day, turning their profound intellectual pact into a tawdry true crime headline. The glass finally moved, not to his lips, but to the desk, where he set it down with a quiet, definitive click. The sound was like a period at the end of a sentence. He had to see the damage up close. The Suffolk County Jail was a symphony of ugly sounds, the clang of steel doors, the buzz of fluorescence, the low murmur of despair. Finch, in his subdued suit, looked like a surgeon who had wandered into a butcher shop. He waited in the sterile visitation room, his posture perfectly still. When Ethan was led in, the boy's face lit up. He saw his teacher, his guide, and read his presence as support, as validation. He sat down, the shackles on his wrists clinking. "Dr. Finch, I knew you'd come." "Ethan," Finch said, his voice a low, careful monotone. "What have you done?" Ethan leaned forward, his eyes blazing with fervor. "What you taught me to do. I'm thinking a level deeper. The trial isn't about guilt. It's about the argument. I can explain it all, the necessity, the philosophy. I can make them understand." Finch listened, his face a mask of pained concentration. Inside, a cold fury was building. The boy had missed the point entirely. The argument was never meant to be made in public. The truth was a weapon, not a pamphlet. "Ethan," Finch interrupted, his voice softening into a tone of grave, almost fatherly concern. "It was a masterpiece of acting. You've made this very real. The law isn't a debate club. They have a confession. They have the camera. This isn't about winning an argument anymore. It's about surviving the consequences." He was speaking a language Ethan didn't yet understand, the language of damage control. Ethan waved a dismissive, shackled hand. "Consequences are for people who make mistakes. I didn't make a mistake. I made a statement. You'll see. With you as a character witness, explaining the pressure, the intellectual environment. They'll have to see it wasn't malice. It was ideology." Finch felt a cold needle of alarm pierce his gut. Character witness. The boy was already scripting his testimony, and casting Finch in a supporting role. A role that would place him directly in the crosshairs. "The court may ask difficult questions about our tutorials," Finch said, choosing each word as if stepping on thin ice. "About the ideas we discussed. They may twist them. They have a way of reducing nuance to sound bites." "Let them," Ethan said, his smile returning. "You can explain it better than anyone. You can make them see." Finch looked at his brilliant, doomed creation. He saw no fear, only fervent, suicidal pride. The tool had become a liability. A loud, messy, attention-grabbing liability. He reached across the table and placed a hand over Ethan's shackled ones, a gesture of profound, tragic connection. "Of course, Ethan. I will do what I can. But you must prepare yourself. The world is not ready for the kind of truth you represent. It punishes what it cannot understand." He was already lying. He wasn't thinking about saving Ethan. He was thinking about saving himself. The visit ended with Ethan buoyant, convinced his master was with him. Finch walked out of the jail into the bland afternoon light, and the mask shattered. His face settled into lines of cold, efficient calculation. He drove not to his campus office, but to a branch public library across town. There, at a computer terminal no one could trace, he began his real work. His searches were meticulous, legal, and damning. Legal definition of undue influence on a minor. Case law, teacher liability for student actions. Effective defense strategies for coercive manipulation. He wasn't researching how to help Ethan. He was researching how to separate himself from Ethan. He was studying the legal firewall he would need to build between his ideas and the boy's actions. The pupil saw a grand alliance, a meeting of two great minds against a blind world. The teacher saw a contagion that needed to be quarantined. And he was preparing the isolation room. Back in the precinct, the case was considered closed. Slam dunk. You had the suspect on camera. You had a proud, detailed confession. The DA's office was already prepping for a straightforward trial. But Detective Mara Cruz couldn't let it go. It was the smile. That was the pebble in her shoe. She sat at her desk in the late-night quiet, the fluorescent hum her only company, and stared at the evidence photos. Leo Vance, slumped, the white chess king in his hand. Ethan's beaming mugshot. She played the confession tape again, listening past the horrifying content to the cadence of his voice. He sounded like a student giving a presentation. A proud one. Her eyes kept drifting back to the chess piece. A signature, he'd said. So they'd know it was principle, not passion. But a signature is for the person who understands it. Who was it really for? She pulled up the faculty directory for Crestmere Academy. Dr. Alastair Finch, Department of Philosophy and Ethics. She'd met him. Helpful. Concerned. He'd been the one to gently, ever so politely, slide Ethan's name into the spotlight. For a mind like Ethan's, winning can become an existential imperative. At the time, it felt like insight. Now, it felt like a planting. She started digging, not into the murder, but into the teacher. A few phone calls to colleagues at other universities, some deep dives into academic journals. Finch's record was brilliant but punctuated with red flags. He'd left a tenured position at an elite college under a cloud of pedagogical disagreements. A published paper of his was cited in a controversy where a student plagiarized a violent, nihilistic manifesto, claiming Finch's lectures inspired its honesty. Then she found the yearbook. The Crestmere yearbook from the previous year. The chess club photo. There, front and center, was the faculty advisor, Dr. Alastair Finch. And standing right beside him, holding a trophy, was the club president, Ethan Chase. The connection was a live wire. Chess wasn't just a metaphor for Ethan. It was a shared language with his teacher. Cruz needed to understand the language. She tracked down a name from Finch's past, Jeremy Albright, a former student from his old university, now a reclusive data analyst living outside Portland. He was reluctant to talk, his voice over the phone frayed with old anxiety. "I just have a few questions about Dr. Finch's teaching style," Cruz said, keeping her voice neutral. A long silence. "His style," Jeremy finally said, the words sounding bruised. "He didn't teach you what to think. He taught you that what you already thought was more valid than what everyone else believed. He'd find your secret arrogance, your hidden contempt, and he'd water it. He'd call it intellectual courage." "Did he ever tell you to do anything wrong?" Jeremy gave a hollow laugh. "No, never. That was the genius of it. He just asked questions. If the rule is unjust, why follow it? If a sentiment is a weakness, why indulge it? He made morality feel sentimental, stupid. He had files, you know." Cruz sat up. Files. On his promising students. He called them developmental case studies. Notes on our personalities, our vulnerabilities, our intellectual potential. He said it was to tailor his mentorship. A cold knot tightened in Cruz's stomach. She thanked him and hung up. The next day, she went back to Crestmere. Not to the crime scene, but to Finch's office. She didn't call ahead. She found him there, amidst his books, looking every bit the grieving mentor. The air smelled of dust and pretension. "Detective," he said, rising, a mask of polite surprise on his face. "To what do I owe the visit? More questions about poor Ethan." "In a way," Cruz said, not sitting down. She wandered the room, her eyes scanning the shelves. "I've been thinking about influence. How a teacher's ideas can shape a student's actions." Finch's smile was thin. "A teacher can only present ideas, detective. The student chooses what to do with them. As tragic as it is, Ethan's choices were his own." Were they? Cruz turned to face him. "He quotes philosophers like they're instruction manuals. He sees the world as a chessboard. He left a chess piece at the scene. You were the chess club advisor." She let that hang. "You two spoke a very specific language, didn't you?" For the first time, a flicker of something cold passed behind Finch's eyes. Not fear. Annoyance. Like a master chess player spotting an unexpected, but minor, move from an amateur. "We discussed strategy and logic, yes," Finch conceded, folding his hands. "In an abstract, academic sense. To suggest I bear any responsibility for his grotesque misinterpretation of those concepts is not only libelous, detective, it is a profound misunderstanding of education itself. He was good." He was turning her inquiry into an attack on academic freedom. But Cruz saw the slight tightening of his jaw, the over-precise wording. "These developmental case studies you keep," Cruz pressed, "on your promising students. Would Ethan's file include notes on his existential imperatives?" The room went very still. Finch's expression didn't change, but the air around him seemed to freeze solid. He hadn't expected her to know about the files. "Those are private pedagogical notes," he said, his voice now a low, careful chill. "Protected by educational privacy statutes. They are reflections, not blueprints." Cruz nodded slowly, a predator acknowledging another predator's territory. "I'm sure they are. It's just interesting, the patterns. A brilliant, isolated student. A teacher who reframes morality as a weakness. A confession that feels less like a surrender and more like a performance." She took a step toward the door, then paused. "Who was he performing for, Doctor?" She left him standing there, in his tower of books. She had no evidence, not yet. But she had the hunch, solidified into a certainty. The arrogant monster in the jail cell wasn't the mastermind. He was the masterpiece. And she was now looking directly at the artist. Detective Cruz's hunch was a live thing now, squirming in her gut, demanding to be fed. The developmental case files Finch had mentioned, they were the key. They weren't just grade books, they were profiles. Blueprints. If she could see Ethan's, she'd have a map of the manipulation. But without a warrant, which a judge would never grant based on a theory about philosophy, they were locked away in Finch's tower. So she went back to the only other source she had, the first puppet. Jeremy Albright, the former student, had sounded broken over the phone. In person, in the modest, overly neat living room of his Portland apartment, he looked excavated. A man in his late 20s who seemed older. His eyes holding a permanent wince, as if the light hurt. "He ruins you," Jeremy said without preamble, not looking at Cruz, but at his own tightly clasped hands. "Not by what he tells you to do. By what he convinces you you're allowed to do. He finds the crack in your morality, the pride, the resentment, the feeling that you're smarter than all the fools playing by the rules, and he drips wisdom into it until it splits wide open." Cruz kept her voice soft. "Jeremy, what did he have you do?" "Nothing illegal," Jeremy said quickly, a rehearsed line. "It was academic. A paper. He guided me toward a thesis that was essentially an argument for intellectual anarchy. That any action taken by a superior mind in pursuit of its own truth was, by definition, valid. It got published. It got attention. And then I started to believe it. I started applying it." He finally looked up, his eyes shining with the old familiar shame. "I manipulated my roommate out of a research grant. I systematically sabotaged a rival's lab work. I saw them as obstacles. I was correcting the ecosystem." The echo was chilling. It was Ethan's logic, verbatim, from years earlier. "When I finally saw what I'd become," Jeremy whispered, "I crashed. Hard. I told the university board it was all inspired by Finch. They called it a regrettable misinterpretation. He got a warning. I got a voluntary withdrawal and a psychiatric discharge." Cruz leaned forward. "Jeremy, you mentioned files. Did you ever see yours?" A slow, grim nod. "Once. In his office. I caught a glimpse of an open cabinet. Tabbed folders with student names. Mine was thick. He saw me looking and closed it fast. Said it was for tailored pedagogy. But it felt surgical." "And you think Ethan Chase has one?" "I know he does," Jeremy said. He stood up, moved to a small desk, and opened a locked drawer. From it, he pulled a simple, black composition notebook. His hands trembled as he handed it to Cruz. "After I left, I kept a journal, trying to understand what he did to me. This is it. Page 47. Cruz opened the worn book. The writing was frantic, dense. She found the page. October 12th. Met with AF again. He says my clarity is terrifying and beautiful. He asked if I've considered the ultimate expression of a will unshackled by sentiment. He didn't say the word. He never says the word. But he talked about the playwright who murders his rival in the third act, and how the audience applauds the artistry, not the crime. He is painting a picture and waiting for me to step into the frame. I am terrified I want to." She looked up, her blood running cold. Jeremy's testimony was no longer just about the past. It was a pattern. A proven, repeatable pattern. Finch was a factory that produced one specific product, arrogant monsters who believed they were philosophers. While Cruz was uncovering the past, the present was ticking forward in a jail cell 50 miles away. Ethan Chase's confidence was a fortress. He spent his days drafting his own defense arguments, citing philosophers, designing questions for Finch that would illuminate the jury. He was composing a symphony of intellectual justification. Then, a package arrived. Not from his lawyer. It was a battered paperback book, mailed from a generic bookstore address. Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche. There was no note. But on page 88, a single sentence was underlined in crisp, precise pencil strokes. The higher man must learn to laugh at himself in his tragedy. Ethan's heart soared. It was a message. A direct line from his master. He parsed it like scripture. Laugh at himself in his tragedy. Finch was telling him to own the narrative. To wear his confession, his trial, not as a shame, but as a badge of honor. To smile in the courtroom. It was a command to double down on his performance, to be fearless. It was the ultimate sign of faith. He clutched the book to his chest, a sacred text. He didn't see the sentence as it was intended. He didn't see the cold, clinical advice of a manipulator telling his asset to stay the course, to remain the arrogant, unsympathetic monster the prosecution needed him to be. He saw mentorship. He saw solidarity. Back in Portland, Cruz was connecting the final, horrifying dots. Jeremy's journal described Finch's method, the hypotheticals, the artistic allusions, the careful avoidance of direct instruction. The package to Ethan fit the pattern perfectly. He's still guiding him, Cruz said aloud, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. Even now. From a distance. The confession, the arrogance. It's not just Ethan's personality. It's his assignment. She called the Suffolk DA, her voice urgent. The book sent to Chase. Thus spoke Zarathustra. Get it? The underline. It's not encouragement. It's a stage direction. Finch is still orchestrating this. He's making sure Ethan performs the role of the unrepentant genius perfectly, because that's a role a jury will hate. He's not helping Ethan. He's making sure Ethan convicts himself. The puzzle was now complete, and the picture it revealed was more sinister than a single murder. Alastair Finch wasn't just a teacher who'd influenced a killer. He was a serial corrupter. Ethan wasn't his first masterpiece. And if they didn't stop him, he wouldn't be the last. The chess game wasn't over. Finch had just sacrificed his pawn to protect his king. And he was already looking for a new piece to move. The district attorney, a man named Reynolds with the weary posture of a bulldog, listened to Detective Cruz with his eyes closed, pinching the bridge of his nose. She had laid it all out, Jeremy Albright's journal, the pattern, the book sent to Ethan, the developmental files. It's compelling as a psychological profile, Cruz, Reynolds finally said, opening his eyes. But it's all circumstantial. It's philosophy and feelings. We have a video of Ethan Chase walking out of that library. We have a confession where he smiles. A jury will want to hang that kid from the nearest tree. They're not going to want a seminar on toxic mentorship. Cruz leaned on his desk. Sir, with all respect, we're not just trying to convict a kid. We're trying to expose the virus that created him. If we don't, Finch just goes back to his tower and finds another Ethan. Jeremy Albright was the beta test. Chase is the version 1 release. Reynolds sighed. What's your play? We can't charge Finch. We have zero direct evidence linking him to the murder. He wasn't in the library. He didn't hand the kid a weapon. All we have is that he's a creepy, influential teacher. Exactly, Cruz said, a sharp glint in her eye. So we don't charge him. We subpoena him. We call him as a witness. For the prosecution. Reynolds stared at her, then slowly began to understand. A slow, grim smile spread across his face. You want to force him into the open, he murmured. We make him a character witness against Ethan, Cruz nodded. He'll love it. It's the perfect platform for him to perform, the wise, sorrowful mentor explaining the tragic flaw in his brilliant student. He'll get to pontificate on the stand, to shape the narrative one last time. But under oath, in cross-examination, we lead him out onto the thin ice. We get him talking about his pedagogy. We introduce Jeremy's testimony. We ask about the files. We make him defend his ideas in front of a jury of ordinary people who will hear how he talks about superior minds and ecosystems, and feel a deep, instinctive revulsion. The plan was elegant. It was a legal jiu-jitsu move. Use Finch's own ego, his need to be the smartest person in the room, the puppet master explaining the strings, as the trap. They wouldn't get him for murder. They would get him exposed, disgraced, and hopefully, for conspiracy or coercion. They would make the jury see two defendants, the one in the chair and the one in the tweed jacket. Across town, in his immaculate, silent home, Alastair Finch received the subpoena. He read the formal language summoning him to testify for the Commonwealth against Ethan Chase. He didn't react with anger or panic. He set the paper down on his mahogany desk, aligned it perfectly with the edge, and allowed himself a small, cold smile. They were playing right into his hands. To them, he was a witness. To him, it was a final lecture hall. The entire courtroom would be his class. The jury, his new students. He would perform the role of the tragic intellectual so perfectly, so movingly, that any suggestion he was a malign influence would seem like a vulgar conspiracy theory. He would bury Ethan with kindness and regret, and in doing so, bury any link to himself. He began his preparation. Not with a lawyer, but with a mirror. He practiced his expressions. The sorrowful glance, the pained hesitation when discussing Ethan's dark turn, the humble acceptance of his own failure to reach him. He selected his suit, not his best, but his most respectable, most trustworthy one. A uniform of innocence. He knew they might ask about the book. He had an answer ready. I sent it to offer solace, to show him even the greatest minds grapple with tragedy. His interpretation was a profound distortion. He knew they might unearth Jeremy. He had an answer for that too. A troubled young man who, like Ethan, tragically misapplied abstract philosophical concepts. His defense was not denial, but reframing. He was the gardener, heartbroken that two of his most beautiful blooms had grown twisted. The fault was in the soil of their own souls, not in his water. The stage was now set. The trial of Ethan Chase would begin in 1 week. But in the minds of the prosecution, and in the cold heart of Alastair Finch, a second secret trial was already underway. A trial of ideas. A trial for the soul of a killer, and the man who claimed he only taught him how to think. Ethan, in his cell, was jubilant when his lawyer told him Finch would be testifying. He's going to explain it all, Ethan said, pacing the small space. He's going to make them see the context, the pressure, the intellectual environment. It's perfect. He had no inkling that the man he saw as his salvation was preparing to be his executioner. The final lesson was coming, and it would be taught from the witness stand. The air in the courtroom on the first day of testimony was so thick with tension you could chew it. It smelled of old wood, wool suits, and a faint metallic trace of human anxiety. Every seat was packed. The world had come to see the smiling boy. Ethan Chase, in a suit that looked borrowed and too big, seemed smaller in the defendant's chair. But his eyes were alive, darting, waiting. He was on display, and he was ready to perform. When the prosecution called him to the stand, a shocked murmur rippled through the gallery. It was a bold, dangerous move. Ada Grayson was going straight for the throat. Ethan settled into the witness box like it was a throne. He took the oath without flinching. And then he began. He didn't wait for questions. He launched into a monologue. To understand my actions, he said, his voice clear and resonant, you must first discard the fairy tale of absolute good and evil. Morality is a situational algorithm. Leo Vance wasn't a person in that equation. He was a negative value. My action was a correction, a necessary deletion for a more perfect system. He spoke of force vectors and spinal dislocation with the calm of a physics professor. He described the staging as symbolic clarity. He was articulate, intelligent, and utterly, bone-chillingly soulless. The jury stared, some with open mouths, others with faces hard as stone. He was giving them exactly what they expected, a monster. And he was proud of it. Ada Grayson let him talk, her face a mask of professional disgust. When he finally paused, she asked, softly, "Do you feel any remorse for ending a young man's life?" Ethan's head tilted. The famous smile began to form, serene and untouchable. Remorse is an emotional spasm for the illogical. I feel resolution. That's when it happened. As Grayson opened her mouth to respond, the heavy oak door at the back of the courtroom let out that long, low, groaning creak. Every single head turned. And there he was. Dr. Alastair Finch. He stood in the doorway for a moment, a silhouette of modest authority, before walking in with a slow, somber gait. He found a seat in the very back row, directly in Ethan's sightline. He sat, folded his hands in his lap, and lifted his eyes to meet his students. And Ethan's smile, it changed. It didn't vanish. It solidified. The serene pride sharpened into a spark of intense, focused recognition. He's here. He's come to see my triumph. The smile became a signal. Watch this. He turned back to the DA, his confidence supercharged. He was no longer just defending himself. He was performing for his master. After a recess that crackled with speculation, the prosecution called their next witness. The Commonwealth calls Dr. Alastair Finch to the stand. A fresh wave of whispers swept the room. Ethan sat up straighter, his eyes bright. This was it. The explanation. The context. Finch walked to the stand with the dignified sorrow of a pallbearer. He took the oath, his hand steady on the Bible. When he sat, he didn't look at Ethan. He looked at the jury, his expression one of profound, weary sadness. Ada Grayson began gently. "Dr. Finch, you were Ethan Chase's teacher." "I was," Finch replied, his voice low and mellifluous, made for lecturing. "Can you describe him as a student?" Finch sighed, a sound of genuine-seeming grief. "Brilliant. The most purely analytical mind I've ever encountered. But it was a brilliance that existed in a vacuum. He had a profound detachment from human sentiment. We discussed philosophical concepts, the works of Nietzsche, Camus, the structure of society. He was fascinated by the idea of the transcendent individual, one who operates beyond conventional morality. He was describing a monster, but his tone was one of tragic fascination. "Did you ever encourage violence?" Grayson asked. "Good heavens, no," Finch said, with a pained shake of his head. "We discussed ideas. Abstract principles. It is the terrible tragedy of this case that he applied the cold logic of a philosophical premise to the warm reality of a human life. I have asked myself 1,000 times where I failed to reach him, to anchor him to our shared humanity. He was perfect. The brilliant, regretful mentor. He was building Ethan's coffin with words of praise and sighs of regret. Ethan's smile had frozen on his face. It was starting to crack at the edges. He was listening, but the script was wrong. Finch wasn't explaining the pressure, the unfair system. He was pathologizing him, calling him detached. A failed experiment. Grayson held up the copy of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. "Did you send this book to the defendant while he was in jail?" "I did," Finch admitted, bowing his head slightly. A foolish, hopeful gesture. "I thought if he could see how even the greatest minds grapple with the concept of suffering and overcoming, he might find a path to introspection, to remorse. I see now it was naive. Laugh at yourself in your tragedy." The underlined sentence burned in Ethan's mind. He had thought it was a call to arms. Now, hearing Finch's soft, sorrowful voice, it sounded like a diagnosis. A prescription for the madness Finch was now painting for the jury. As Finch spoke, his eyes finally drifted to Ethan. Not with solidarity, but with a look of profound, apologetic disappointment. It was the look a sculptor gives a statue that has cracked in the kiln. In that moment, In the silent, screaming space between the witness stand and the defendant's table, the first seed of understanding was planted in Ethan Chase's mind. It wasn't a full realization yet. It was a chill, a discontinuity. His teacher wasn't here to save him. His teacher was here to bury him. And he was using the very brilliance he'd nurtured as the shovel. For a long moment after Finch stepped down from the witness stand, the only sound in the courtroom was the faint, angry scratch of the court reporter's stenograph. Ethan Chase sat perfectly still. The frozen smile was gone, wiped clean. In its place was a blankness so profound it was more terrifying than any snarl. Inside his head, a universe was collapsing and reassembling itself at light speed. Finch's words weren't just a betrayal. They were a retroactive rewrite of his entire reality. Every tutorial, every approving nod, every Socratic question about the ecosystem and obstacles, it hadn't been mentorship. It had been manufacturing. Finch hadn't been cultivating a protégé. He'd been programming a weapon, and was now feigning shock that it had fired. The hurt was a white-hot spike, but it was instantly consumed by a colder, more familiar fuel, rage. Not a hot rage, but a rage of absolute zero. A calculating rage. Ada Grayson stood. Your Honor, the prosecution calls its next witness Jeremy Albright. Finch, who had been gathering his things to leave, froze halfway out of his seat. His head snapped toward the prosecution's table. That was the first crack in his mask, a flash of pure, unvarnished surprise, then alarm. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected them to find the first puppet. Jeremy's testimony was a quiet earthquake. He spoke haltingly about the case files, the tailored philosophy, the way Finch made amorality feel like intellectual courage. He didn't accuse Finch of telling him to break the law. He accused him of carefully removing his conscience, brick by brick, until breaking the law seemed logical. When he described his own corrective actions against his peers, the echo of Ethan's confession was deafening. A pattern, proven. Finch's lawyer objected constantly. Relevance. Hearsay. But the damage was done. The jury wasn't just looking at a grieving teacher anymore. They were looking at a man with a history. A recurring theme. When it was the defense's turn for cross-examination, Ethan's court-appointed lawyer rose. But before he could speak, Ethan's voice cut through the room, flat and cold. I will question this witness. A gasp. The judge frowned. Mr. Chase, you are represented by counsel. And I am exercising my right to participate in my own defense, Ethan said. His eyes locked not on the judge, but on Finch. I have questions for my teacher. The judge, after a tense conference, allowed it. Ethan stood, smoothing his ill-fitting suit. He walked slowly to the lectern, a predator with all the time in the world. The boy who had proudly confessed was gone. In his place stood something new, a student who had just discovered the answer to the final exam. Dr. Finch, Ethan began, his voice devoid of all emotion. You testified that our discussions were abstract, philosophical. They were, Finch said, his composure back but his eyes wary. You said you never encouraged violence. I did not. Ethan picked up a transcript from his table. In our session on October 12th, you asked me, in a game of chess, what do we call a piece that blocks the path of the king? He looked up. What was the answer you were looking for, Doctor? Finch's jaw tightened. It was a metaphorical discussion about strategy. The answer is an obstacle, Ethan said, speaking to the jury. And when I gave that answer, you asked the follow-up, and what is the purpose of an obstacle? He let the silence hang. To be removed. Was that also metaphor? You are stripping the conversation of its academic context, Finch said, a note of steel entering his voice. I'm applying it to the context of my life, Ethan fired back, his voice rising for the first time. Just like Jeremy Albright applied his. Isn't that the point of your tailored pedagogy? To take the abstract and make it personal? To find the crack in our morality and pour your philosophy into it until it splits. He was turning Finch's own weapons against him, using logic to trap the logician. You sent me a book in jail, Ethan pressed, holding up Zarathustra. You underlined a sentence about laughing in tragedy. Was that metaphor too? Or was it a stage direction? To make sure I played the unrepentant monster perfectly for the jury? To make sure I was so hated that no one would ever look behind me? At you. The accusation landed like a bomb. Finch's face went pale. That is a grotesque distortion. Is it? Ethan's voice dropped to a deadly whisper. Or is it just thinking a level deeper? The physical move, the murder, the psychological reaction, the proud confession, and the truth that remains. He swept his hand toward Finch. The puppet master, safe in the shadows, having proven his theory once again. He had done it. He had articulated Detective Cruz's entire theory, but from the inside. He had become the string cutter, using the very logic Finch had taught him to sever their connection in front of God and everyone. The courtroom erupted. The judge hammered his gavel. Finch looked at Ethan, and for one unguarded moment, all the false sorrow was gone. What was left was a pure, icy fury. The anger of a creator whose creation had just turned and named him. Ethan didn't smile. He just nodded, a small, cold acknowledgement. The lesson was finally over. He had learned the most important one, how to betray the master. And now, he had to use it to survive. The morning Ethan Chase took the stand for the last time, the air in the courtroom had a different charge. Before, people had leaned in to see a monster perform. Now, they held still, sensing a snake about to strike. He looked broken. The arrogant posture was gone, replaced by a slumped weariness. The sharp light in his eyes had dimmed to a confused, watery haze. His hands, once so steady, now fidgeted with a button on his sleeve. This wasn't the smiling boy. This was a lost, frightened kid. When his own lawyer asked him to state his name, his voice was a fragile thread. Ethan Chase. Ethan, his lawyer began gently. You confessed to the murder of Leo Vance. Do you stand by that confession? A long, trembling silence. Ethan's eyes darted, not to the jury, but to the back row where Dr. Finch sat, now watching with the wary focus of a bomb technician. Then Ethan's face crumpled. A single, shocking tear traced a path down his cheek. No, he whispered. Then stronger, voice cracking. No, I don't. A unified intake of breath swept the room. The judge leaned forward. Ada Grayson's pen froze above her legal pad. I lied, Ethan said, the words tumbling out now, charged with a desperate, believable energy. I was so confused. I've been told for so long that what I was thinking was right, was brilliant, that when everything went wrong I thought confessing was what he would want. That it was the final proof of my understanding. Who are you talking about, Ethan? His lawyer asked, though everyone already knew. Ethan's tear-filled eyes locked on Finch. He pointed a shaking finger. Him. Dr. Finch. He didn't pull the trigger. He built the gun. And then he loaded it, and pointed it, and made me believe pulling it was my own brilliant idea. He spun the entire narrative. He described the tutorials not as intellectual feasts, but as slow, methodical isolations. He'd tell me my discomfort with normal emotions was a sign of higher thought. That my resentment for Leo wasn't petty, it was diagnostic of a corrupted system. He used Finch's own words, but now they sounded like the grooming tools of a predator. The chess piece, Ethan sobbed, the performance masterful in its shattered authenticity. It wasn't my signature. It was his symbol. The game he was playing with me. I left it because somewhere in my messed-up head, I thought it would please him. That he'd see it and know I'd finally completed his assignment. He saved his most devastating blow for last. He spoke of the book, Zarathustra. The underlined sentence. Laugh at yourself in your tragedy. I thought it was a call to be strong. Now I see it. He was telling me to play the fool. To play the arrogant monster so perfectly that no one would ever think to look at the man who created me. He sent me that book not to comfort me, but to direct me. One last time. The courtroom was in pandemonium. Finch stared, his face a rigid mask of stone, but a tiny muscle twitched violently in his jaw. This wasn't in his calculations. He'd prepared for arrogance, for defiance. He had no defense against this collapse. This recantation wrapped in the shroud of victimhood. Ethan wasn't claiming innocence. He was claiming he'd been robbed of the very capacity to understand innocence. He was painting himself as Finch's ultimate creation and his ultimate victim. The proud monster was gone. In the box was a shattered puppet, pointing a broken finger at the puppeteer. As he was led, weeping, from the stand, the entire axis of the trial shifted. It was no longer just about what Ethan had done. It was about who had built him, and with what tools. The jury wasn't looking at a killer anymore. They were looking at a crime scene with two bodies, Leo Vance's and Ethan Chase's humanity. And in the back, Alastair Finch finally understood the true genius of his pupil. Not in the murder, not in the confession, but in this breathtaking, ruinous act of betrayal. Ethan had learned the final, most devastating lesson: how to use the master's own blueprint to burn the workshop down. The verdict is coming. But who will truly be held accountable? The weapon or the hand that forged it? If this twist has you questioning everything you thought you knew about this case, then make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. The final chapters, where the gavel falls and the real consequences unfold, are coming next. You won't want to miss the conclusion. The day the verdicts came down, the sky over Boston was a flat, unfeeling gray. The courtroom felt smaller, as if the weeks of tension had shrunk the walls. You could smell the nervous sweat of the reporters jammed in the back, the faint floral perfume of Leo Vance's mother, the ozone of impending storm. Ethan Chase and Alastair Finch sat at separate tables, islands in a sea of wood paneling. They did not look at each other. Ethan's face was hollow, all performance gone, just empty exhaustion. Finch's was a carefully composed mask of academic stoicism, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the table. The jury filed in. Their faces gave nothing away. That was the first sign. The judge spoke. In the matter of the Commonwealth versus Ethan Chase, on the charge of murder in the first degree, how do you find? The foreman stood. We find the defendant guilty of murder in the second degree. Not premeditated. Not the full weight. A concession. A recognition, perhaps, of the why. A murmur rippled through the room. Ethan didn't react. He just closed his eyes. 25 years to life. The monster was caged. The smile was finally, forever, gone. Then, the judge turned. In the matter of the Commonwealth versus Alastair Finch, on the charges of corruption of a minor and criminal solicitation, how do you find? Finch's mask slipped for a microsecond. A flicker of sheer, icy focus. Guilty. The word was clean, sharp, and final. On the lesser charges. Not for murder. But guilty. Of poisoning a mind. Of weaponizing philosophy. The sentencing was a study in contrasts. Ethan, standing before the judge, was asked if he had anything to say. He said nothing. He was a void. He was led away, his chains rattling, to begin a life measured in cement and steel. Finch, when it was his turn, spoke with grave eloquence. I accept the court's judgment, and I mourn my failure, my profound failure, to instill ethical guardrails alongside intellectual ambition. He was still performing, still shaping the narrative for the history books. He got 10 years. A decade for dismantling a soul. Outside the courthouse, the circus erupted. News vans, shouting headlines, Killer Genius gets 25. Teacher corrupts pupil. It felt cheap. Like fast food wrapped in tragedy. Detective Mara Cruz watched from the steps, feeling no victory, only a deep, gritty fatigue. She'd gotten her convictions. But it felt like scooping up water with a sieve. She'd stopped one crime, but the crime of the mind, the infection Finch represented. How do you incarcerate that? Weeks later, she visited the maximum security facility where Ethan was held. He sat behind thick glass, smaller in his orange jumpsuit, his brilliance faded to a dull sheen. They didn't talk about the case. They didn't talk about Leo. After 10 minutes of silence, Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time with a semblance of their old, piercing clarity. "Detective Cruz," he said, his voice scratchy from disuse. "One question." She waited. Did he ever believe it? Ethan asked, the ghost of a child's need in his voice. "When he called my mind beautiful, when he said it was formidable, did he ever believe I was truly brilliant? Or was it all just parts for the machine?" Cruz held his gaze. She thought of Jeremy Albright. She thought of the files. She thought of the cold fury in Finch's eyes when his creation turned on him. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The slow, crumbling despair in Ethan's face told her he'd finally found a truth he couldn't logic his way around. He would serve his 25 years wondering if the only person who ever saw his worth was just admiring his utility as a weapon. That was Finch's final, lasting punishment for his favorite pupil. Not the prison term. The doubt. 5 years later, on a Tuesday that smelled like rain and industrial bleach, a young journalist named Sarah Keene walked through the secured gates of the medium-security prison where Alastair Finch was housed. Her book proposal was titled The Crestmere Paradox: Education or Corruption. She'd gotten the interview because Finch, ever the strategist, agreed. A chance to shape his legacy. They met in a visitation room that was all chipped linoleum and wire-reinforced windows. Finch entered, looking older, softer in his standard-issue khakis. His silver hair was neatly combed. He moved with a calm, unhurried pace. A model prisoner. "Thank you for seeing me, Dr. Finch," Sarah began, her recorder between them. "Please," he said, with a small, tired smile. "Alastair. I'm not a doctor anymore." He spoke with practiced humility. He expressed regret, not for his ideas, but for how they were misapplied. He called Ethan and Jeremy tragic case studies in the perils of intellectual isolation. He said he spent his days teaching GED classes to fellow inmates, trying to give back. Atonement through basic literacy, he called it, his tone wistful. He was convincing. He sounded reformed. He was the picture of a brilliant mind, humbled and redeemed. Sarah took notes, but a cold doubt nestled in her gut. His answers were too perfect, like a well-rehearsed lecture. The interview ended. A guard came to lead him back. As Finch stood, Sarah packed her bag, her journalist's eye still active. That's when she saw it. A new inmate was being led into the administrative area across the hall. Young, maybe 19, with sharp, intelligent eyes that darted around, taking in the system, assessing it. He had the look of a feral, underfed academic. Finch paused at the door. His gaze fell on the young man. The humble, repentant mask he'd worn for the past hour didn't crack. It simply evaporated. For less than a second, his eyes ignited with that old, familiar, hungry light. The look of a sculptor finding a perfect new block of marble. The look of a chess master spotting a promising, unmoved piece. Then he blinked, smiled politely at the guard, and disappeared down the cement corridor. Sarah stood frozen, her recorder off, her notes suddenly feeling like childish scribbles. She understood now. The guilt, the atonement, the GED classes, it was all just a new syllabus. A new environment. The master hadn't been rehabilitated. He'd just been relocated. The real horror wasn't that he'd created one monster. It was that the factory was still open. It was just running a quieter shift. She walked out into the gray afternoon, the story she'd come to write dead in her hands. The real story was still being written. Inside. On a blackboard only 2 people could see, in a language that looked like wisdom but tasted like poison. The lesson was far from over.